Hi, my name is Sarah Clunas. I am the Director of Academic Partnerships and Curator of the African Collection at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University. Today I'm working with the Center for African Studies at Harvard to interview South African artist, fashion designer, and social justice activist Gavin Rajah. Gavin, how are you? Thank you so much for meeting with us today. I wanted to focus our conversations on ideas about cultural knowledge, on how knowledge systems are communicated through material culture and through visual stories. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are your ancestors? Where did you grow up? And share with us a little bit about your childhood memories.
So my name is Gavin Rajah, and I'm known as a design entrepreneur, but also as a activist in the kind of humanitarian initiative space. So my work is largely driven by issues related to children and to women, and more so now just around gender-based violence. I grew up in South Africa. I'm fourth generation. And as far as we can trace it back, our family comes from very, very small villages in Rajasthan. And they came over to South Africa as indentured laborers and to work in sugarcane fields. So my parents, though, obviously, through the generations, as with many Indian families, the focus has been on education and creating a better life, which is quite a difficult thing to do because you had many strokes against you in South Africa, apartheid being the biggest one. But even with apartheid, there are standards of discrimination. So in some way or the other, whilst you were classified as black, the government kind of imposed further categories in terms of access, in terms of benefit. And so you had, black African people, you had coloreds, you had Indians, and then you had others, which could have been Asian or, Chinese, other Far East Asian minorities. And they were also classified within the Group Areas Act and the classification of races. So these kind of things, when growing up, you kind of in that space, and maybe you just surrounded by your community and people around you try and protect you as much as possible. But as you grow older and you look back, you realize just exactly, people are searching for an identity. What is identity? What is it to be a person of color? And in South Africa versus today where I'm visiting in America, and so these things have always informed my views of the world. And in some ways, I think my need to kind of find this justice or the sense of kind of access, equality for people. And I use my work, I use my visibility now instead of maybe getting a table at a restaurant, but to try and pursue or challenge kind of legislations or try and initiate changes in legislation and or rules around people. I think growing up, one is obviously, you look at culture and what is culture, and for South Africa, it's a melting pot of many cultures, like many countries around the world. And I think you absorb many things around you. You absorb things wherever you're based from a geographical perspective, the communities you interact with. And as you grow older, these things are informed by many different things which shape you. Obviously, being immersed in the fashion industry is quite interesting because an aesthetic is imposed by the West on you. And you are kind of forced to conform to this. I remember showing in Paris and people expecting it to be only African prints. What are African prints? Are they actually African prints, or they've just been absorbed into the culture? And they're kind of remnants of the Dutch East India Company bringing in things from other places that exploited. So, batik prints are are they really African? Do we even have a mask in any of the cultures in South Africa? No, but you kind of expected to embrace this. So these are impositions, and I try and break this down in my work because I think these are perspectives that other people put on what your work should be, or how being African should be, what it should be defined as. So if you look at work right now, it's quite crazy, but I'm quite against like creating poverty porn type of narratives or showing imagery of very emasculated kind of men, you know, and all this kind of nomadic tribe lifestyle. But maybe that's just me. So yeah, I suppose that's me in a little bit of a nutshell, and the things that I'm influenced by and things that I'm guided by. But talking about culture, I think it's something which changes all the time. It's quite a fluid concept for me. And the more I travel, the more I interact with people, absorb other things and other cultures as well into my work.
Well, I think it's so great, because it's an interesting, the kind of global experience. Because I'm originally from Jamaica, but my grandmother, or my great grandfather actually, came from Madras, which is now Chennai. And he came to Jamaica after the emancipation of slavery to work on a sugarcane plantation. So, just as we've spoken before, we had never mentioned that particular detail. I felt like a moment in which we were connected through where we are from. We're from two very, very different places, but yet there are these connections. There are African connections, there are Indian connections. So what did your parents do? You had said that your father was involved in in the garment production, in the garment manufacture. Can you maybe speak to us a little bit about this and how this involvement with creativity and cloth, or fashion really influenced your own individual journey?
So my father was actually very, very well educated, which is a kind of bad thing in South Africa at that time. I mean, he was strangely enough shipped off by his mother to go stay with her sister, which is in Sao Paulo in Brazil. So he had access to education, and he had been raised in a very different kind of community. And when he returned to South Africa, it was very foreign for him. And the qualifications that he had as an industrial engineer were just not there were just no jobs for him, and if there were jobs, he was just the wrong color. But strangely enough, people saw his talent and acknowledged his skill set, and he was quickly embraced by a company which had Jewish owners. So I think they could connect with the fact that there was this hardship and there was a strife, and my father was trying to find his space and provide for his family, and so they employed him, and I saw how hard he worked, because even though he had these amazing people who were sympathetic to him, he still had to work far harder than everybody else. And he always said to me, "You see how hard I work? I don't ever want to see you work this hard." But from a distance, I think I was attracted to clothing and textiles and this color. And I think I kind of have an irreverent sense of color even in my work. But so he was really, I think, silent. He didn't really know until towards the end of his life. He was super proud of me. But I mean, the whole thing was like, good Indian boys grow up to be doctors, accountants, lawyers, and fit into that kind of mold. And my mum was just, was the same. She was also educated. She was in the community health field. So I kind of also had this thing of my dad, who had always wanted to be a lawyer and actually became an industrial engineer, and my mother, who was in this medicine field. And so they were trying to grapple and push me into both things. And eventually I ended up choosing to do a law degree. So I have no formal training in fashion at all, other than from what I saw around me. and watching, hanging out during holidays in my dad's space and watching the people who work there create things. So I kind of just saw things and absorbed things. And over the years, of course, I've made many mistakes and failed many times and tried many things on my own and learned, but I've learned through that process. And I think the law background at the University of Cape Town, where I studied, has given me the sense of what is right and what is wrong. And growing up and having to study during apartheid was very interesting, because I remember back then I had to get permission to even study at this university, to even stay on campus. And you learn, and you learned at that time, whilst we had great role models around us who were really working very hard, and we had icons like Nelson Mandela, who I was very privileged later on to work very closely with, and kind of starting things up like the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, and this was all inspired by my sense of wanting to achieve justice. But law and education at that time was also inaccessible to many people, from whether it be from a financial kind of perspective, coming into this kind of foreign culture of going to a very, very obviously white university and being marginalized. So there were many things against us, but it always informed my position of what my work should be. And I always thought whether I'd turn out to be a lawyer, I would want to champion the causes of those who are vulnerable, and to give voice to those who are silent. And I've learned to still do that in my work. I've used my work as a platform to empower women, children, build clinics, forge partnerships with other people doing great things. And generally, for the longest time, I was seen in the very early stages of my career as a rabble-rouser, especially in the fashion industry, because there were no designers of color. In fact, there are very few of them. And I still challenge those who are in color to kind of lift those behind them, and to give opportunity to those that are kind of coming up in the rungs of the industry. So yeah, it is a very interesting thing, but I think my parents really provided that emotional infrastructure for me to pursue my work, my craft, and my own identity, which I was very fortunate to have, because in a culture which was very, very, very conservative, not just the Indian community, but in South Africa generally, further kind of entrenched by this overwhelming, oppressive regime, that it was a very important thing, because I think they gave me this ability to pursue the things I wanted to do fearlessly, and they still do.
What I think is so interesting about that is that they had particular dreams for you. And yet I think, we'll talk about this a little bit later in the conversation, but I see that your father's experience with justice as a lawyer, and also with garment production manufacture, and in your mother's experience with healing have all come together in your particular professional experience and your work. So I can see definitely, based on your stories about your family and your parents and how they have created a great force through you, but a little bit more about, I think, because growing up in, like you said, such an oppressive regime in South Africa, there was so much segregation, and yet I think I've heard you talk about this concept, a concept of hybridity in your work. So let me quote you. You said, the New World Order is interested in hybrids. Can you expand a little bit about what you mean by this and how you see this, embracing of multiple identities as important for our future, maybe coming from your own personal experience?
So obviously my studio is filled with young people, and these young people who have a passion for design. And, I've started projects in South Africa. One of the biggest is called Future Wear. And Future Wear is in the fashion industry. It's a creative incubator, maybe, and it's not necessarily relegated to fashion. It's open to anybody who has an interest for it. And I have always thought of myself when I create these projects, because I thought I was really not a fashion designer. I had no training whatsoever. I just had an eye and an idea of what I thought was great, and had one of those sets of Indian parents who, you went to art class, you went to speech and drama, you did music, you did any of those things. And really, I would have been a musician, if anything, I think, because I was really good at it. But, it was a sense of freedom I felt. But I was very good at many things. And I think that when I look around now, I think people need to be kind of multi-talented or tasked or skilled. And these things actually help them, So I look at young kids who come to me and then they say, they'd really like to be in fashion, but they've got no training. I say, that's great. I don't think you should be constrained by anything. Let me see what you can do. And so do you have what are the other things that you enjoy? And I mean, I have people who enjoy photography. I have people who enjoy being amazing cooks. All of things are talent. I think in a country like South Africa, especially where access to education and to formal training is not that easy and still very, very difficult, and there's still a cost attached to it. There's a need to democratize education and access to training. So when people have this small little passion, I'm always saying pursue it, because that passion could turn into a future career. And that's exactly kind of what happened to me. And and many of the people around me that I see who are very successful, they've literally just refined passions or kind of hobbies and taken it to a next level. But I think all their interests kind of meld into one thing to inform where they are and to inform their identity. I mean, I'm working very closely with an artist called Zanele Maholi, who's quite prolific in her work that she does, and we have these amazing chats. But she tells me, or they tell me about a time where they were just an office worker and they were a hairdresser. But when I look at the work at the moment, everything kind of centers around creating things around the head. Hair. What does hair mean to Black people, identities? How does it define them? So I see all of these things all coming together, and that in my work was the same thing. I think the future needs these hybrids. I think we need to have the same type of fluidity to kind of accommodate change, to include change in our work, and to also see how we can either improve or refine our process of what we do by including these different aspects around us. And really people who know me know that today I'm reading Umberto Eco on beauty on ugliness, or tomorrow I'm reading some other kind of crazy thing from Baudelaire's Le Fleur de Mal or something. But these are all different things. But at the same time, I'm very couched in, recently I've become very reconnected to India. For the longest time, I think Indians outside India felt that there was no connection, and especially in South Africa, where you have a history of apartheid, they felt that there was no connection because India wasn't offering any kind of support. It was just talk. You couldn't go back to this country. But now I find that, and I look at things, and I look at traditional cultural motifs and art and craft and stuff like that, and I look at people outside India, in America, in the UK, and they're also trying to forge an identity, an Indian identity outside. But it's quite interesting how they bring different things to create this new fabric of identity. So I'm definitely South African, and people ask me, and I say that very proudly, but what does it mean to be a South African Indian? It means a lot of things, and those lots of things are hybrid. It's a hybrid of different interests, ideas, relationships, interactions with people. So yeah, I do think so, and I do think that the world, this world that we're in and going into the future, needs people that are good at many things, and have experience in many things, not just one thing. And I also think, just as I always say to people around me, especially young people, I say it's very boring just to do one thing. I said you have to be this, you have to try different things to find this, you continuously refining practice or your life by having different experiences. And I think those different experiences add to the end product or your end journey or what it is that you want to leave behind.
So there's a lot of what I would call upcycling in your work. You're not only your materials, but also looking at cultural practice. You had spoken about this idea about cultural tropes, like animal prints or ostrich feathers or beaded designs or even the Dutch wax prints. And, I'm interested in, what you would consider in terms of, South African literal and cultural landscapes, maybe even stereotypes associated with these, and how you kind of turn these on their head with your designs and thrust them into the future. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how you are taking these kinds of cultural tropes and rethinking them? You sort of, you said sort of these are the things that you don't really like the whole, nomadic thing. But what works and what doesn't work for you?
So for me recently in fashion, and it's become very obvious, it's so obvious actually, that there's this kind of urgent need to kind of reflect Black people, to be diverse in campaigns, in fashion. We've been screaming at it for the longest time, but suddenly now there's this sense of urgency. And I look back and, with this connection with India, I look at the most amazing work India does, and I think, why isn't India a fashion force to be reckoned with? Why is it just the European capitals and, of course, American English capitals? New York Fashion Week, London Fashion Week. Why are those the ones only driving it to be the capitals? There, you never see American designers just being completely, literally inspired only by Americana or the American flag, but when it comes to like South Africa, everybody's expecting us or wants us because, it's such fun. And I'm so tired of this and I'm really irritated. And young people, because they feel their work won't gain exposure, this is what they do. So editors and fashion kind of influential people, whoever, say, well, they want something. So in one good thing, I think Wakanda's great as a movie, maybe, but is it playing into some weird trope in terms of putting it up? Yes, it is. People don't get it. So am I afraid that Africa and South Africa will end up being like India? Yes, because people constantly want this. The more we tell poor stories of and that's part of our identity, but it shouldn't necessarily always define the product. You can't, at some point there has to be some exclusion of that and people just look at the work. The work can speak for itself sometimes and tell your narrative. There's a narrative behind everything. And I think if we're constantly expecting people from Africa, South Africa, to only talk about how hard it was and focus on that, so there's a sympathy as opposed to an acknowledgement of the actual merit of the work that you put out. And I'm very big on, guys, it's hard for everybody. It's relatively hard for everybody out there. So can we look at the work and can we look at how this, in a way, is just shackling people even more? Because, here's the other thing. Suddenly, people are wanting to show imagery in magazines, editorial images, no strong men, no strong women, but these very kind of emasculated and also very weak images. And also crazy. It's like suddenly let's try and, oh, you know what? Let's try and put a fuller figure model, throw that in. Let's try and actually talk about skin diseases. So let's just find a model with vitiligo and let's just milk it. So it's becoming so contrived. And these tropes don't do anything but entrench more kind of weakness and adds another layer of not making people being free from an economic perspective. One season Burberry might use a African wax print doesn't make it the most desirable thing in the world. It doesn't. But this kind of culture has to stop at some point. It really has to stop. And the other thing with it is the West is very good at identifying maybe one brand or one thing and playing it, but those brands never are sustainable because it's just one person hyping something up, but there's no longevity to it. So the West and other kind of regions, I mean, can't be seen to be helping these businesses, this industry at all if they're going to constantly look at things from that kind of perspective. Things have to change. And they have to realize that other people have stories to tell in different ways. And they might, just because they based on an African content doesn't mean their work has to be geographically confined and culturally confined. You know, each person is open to many experiences, many interactions, and that must reflect at some point in their work too. But it is the most irritating thing. I cannot tell you. I mean, people come to show in New York and you ask yourself how many Black American designers there are there. So what's the chance of an African designer even being successful or recognized?
So this makes me really curious, Gavin, because I think of this idea of, and this may be a little bit controversial, but I think about the role of camp in the critique of colonialism or in patriarchy or gender norms. So I wonder, is there a role, you know, in South African fashion for camp? Does that role exist? And is there a kind of playfulness with fashion and, you know, sort of how fashion provides a commentary for South African history?
So there is an element of camp, but I think the element of camp was introduced not by South Africans themselves, by kind of other photographers, white stylists, editors, who thought it was a great idea. I mean, this concept of, when I talk about Nomads, for instance, is a resort collection that was shot by Louis Vuitton. And I just thought, how tone deaf are you? In an era as well where migrants and this concept, this very hard topic and this very hard experience for people, that you take this and you glamorize it. The same thing is if you look at, you know, an idea of what's camp and men. You know, I look at the experience of men in South Africa who were taken out of their homes in rural areas and put to work in mines. And in these mines, they were subjected to so much of violence. Violence sometimes begets violence quite often. So they came back and they brought this violence into their homes, which never existed before. Because they felt emasculated in these hostels, because there was some form of hierarchy that was there. And so when you kind of show men and African men, and I'm not saying all the time, but most of the time in this very camp, uber dandified kind of way, there's something to be said about this. And especially if you're not actually photographing a camp man, really, but you're taking these very hard masculine men and you're creating a different identity for them. You're imposing something. And so this is the idea also, as you know, very interesting, was looking at an exhibition, remember, which was called Black Harlem. It was in the 60s, and how controversial that was in terms of it being a photographic exhibition, and the narrative that was being told, this poverty kind of porn that played out, and then how kind of a Drake Driscoll changed all of that with that kind of major punctuation in the landscape of like black art and exhibitions by curating I think it was 2 centuries of black art, it was called, and how amazing that was, because that was so much more empowering. And yeah, the photographs were great. I think it was by Art Van Zee, I can't remember, but it was still
Vanderzee.
Vanderzee, yeah, that's it, yeah. But it was still an amazing, empowering thing, and everybody saw a different side of it, because it wasn't done by, it wasn't curated by someone who was tainted by anything. It was, it was about a pure, authentic, and credible exhibition and platform of Black American art. It was just incredible. So for me, this is the same thing that really has to happen. It's about who decides what. I mean, when do we, within our own industry, within our own continent, take ownership of it and say, this is actually what it really is, and we're not afraid to say this. But at the moment, people are afraid because, the West wants to show these kind of wants us to play into these tropes. But I don't think they realize how painful, hurtful, and economically kind of discriminatory it becomes.
So this conversation about gender and tropes and sort of places in which we feel confined, it's important because it leads us into, I think one of your most important contributions. And I think of you as an agent of social change in terms of your philanthropic efforts, but in particular your white light movement. And like I mentioned before, I really do see, and it's so great to have this conversation with you where you share with us stories of your family, because I can see your parents' influence in the healing and the justice and the textiles. It's all there. Can you tell us a little bit about the White Light movement? And I know you're also a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, champion for the rights of women and children. Can you share with us, how you became involved?
So, I mean, really, at law school, I think one of the things that was very involved was a legal aid clinic. And South Africa has a culture of a lot of maids, so domestic workers in homes. And so my work started really with, in these legal aid clinics, with looking at cases where these women were really exploited and didn't really have much legal recourse to either, against their employers, really, who were all actually white. So it started with that, and I just always had this thing of like, I have to do something about this. And it didn't. And when I finished university, I didn't do anything about it. I was just trying to find my feet. I was trying to be employed. And then as the years went by, one of the things obviously came along was the AIDS epidemic. And so, like everywhere in the world, we're faced with, not enough knowledge about this thing, another level of discrimination that was happening, another incident of inaction by governments, not just ours, but many governments around the world, and an exploitation of big pharma in terms of the access of medication and drugs. And literally, I was kind of seeing what was happening, and I was looking at how this affected far north and on the border of like Zimbabwe and South Africa. There's a huge incidence of sex work and trafficking, so there was a higher incidence of transmission of HIV/AIDS. And I was looking at this by pure coincidence while I was in a recce for a client on an event, and I came across the Archbishop of this area, the Diocese of Rustenburg, who said to me, things are really bad here, and I was really seeing people dying. not in a very humane or dignified way. They were out and lying on beds under a tree and things like that. And I said, we've got to do something. So he says, you know, the, the, the Anglican Church can maybe assist with just the land, but, you know, you'd have to make contact with the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So I said, I will do that. And so I called up the Arch when I went back to Cape Town, and he said, you can have the land, but there's no electricity, there's no water there. And that started also my relationship with him, because he kind of gave me this land, and then I suddenly thought, what do I do next? And anyway, I started mobilizing my friends who were in fashion, artists, through a very, very talented British artist as well, called Craig Kilford, and we hosted a huge event called Positive. And I literally wrote to someone like Seal, I was nobody, and said, listen, here's what I'm trying to do. Would you come and help me and do a 45-minute acoustic set? And he said yes. And so we raised millions to build these hospices so children and adults could die in a very dignified way. But I had to find ways of look at ancient ways of architecture, like building these buildings with airflow systems from buildings in Niger and flatbed irrigation systems and stuff like that. And so I was raising all this money to build this and to create access for them. But luckily now they're not used as hospices, they're used as clinic facilities, which is a great thing. And then the more I got kind of this traction, UNICEF approached me to work. But, you know, and I love UNICEF, but the UN is very policy driven. Whilst I'm quite action driven, I want to see change and I want to see it now. And there's definitely a place for policy. But in areas where it's really dire, sometimes you need to stop overthinking a situation and just act. So what happened was I ended up realizing it was at the time I was doing this, very close to World Cup soccer, and I was also made ambassador for World Cup soccer. I don't think the country really liked me much during this time, but I suddenly realized I was encountering incidences of child trafficking and abuse. And I didn't realize as a fact, wherever there's a World Cup soccer taking place in that country, there's a very high instance of abuse, because guess what? Men are out of their countries, they can do whatever they want. So there were these kids being booked online for months ahead, and so I was staging protests and things like that. And I got involved by seeing how bad the injuries were. I got involved by seeing how bad things were in vulnerable communities, and kids couldn't report this, or parents didn't want to report this because there was a stigmatism. So I really worked hard to lobby the police, lobby local government to say, we have to address this. And obviously, I had a little bit more help, because by then I had the UN, who was using me really as a mouthpiece, because they don't really like to disrupt the status quo. But basically, we built this child sex abuse clinic, which in partnership with the Justice Department and police. Kids got picked up in unmarked cars. There were no uniformed policemen. And the big thing was this clinic, a clinic which actually was equipped to get evidence. So without evidence, it's very difficult to secure convictions. And obviously, conviction rates are very important in terms of lessening, or at least we like to think that sometimes. Now more and more it's about educating a community and making them understand things better in terms of violence and why one doesn't behave this way. But having said that, there were these kids, and they were facing sometimes terrible and life-threatening injuries, and they were very young. They were like 6 months old. And so the clinics were seeing kids from 3 months old even, right up until 17, 18 years old. And they still do, and it's still a huge taboo, and people don't speak about it. And on average, they see about 256 to 300 cases a month of child sex abuse, and it's not a feel-good story. It's nothing that people want to take on. And I have a very hard time trying to convince people to support it because there are no posters, there's no campaigns they can shoot, and I certainly don't allow them to take any images. So one of the things I found was that kids were missing court dates, they were missing their appointments at clinics or doctors that I'd got on to donate their time and their services. And this is because most of these women, mothers or grandparents, were financially dependent on someone. So they didn't have the money or the access to bring kids or to travel. So I decided, well, I have to change that. And the way to how could I do it? The only way I could do it was trying to include them and to teach them things that I knew. So then I decided, let's start spreading some light in these terrible areas of darkness. And I thought, right, let's come up with this nonprofit which would look at training them, empowering them, teaching them financial literacy, so they would also get their children out of that community, because quite often the abuser went back into the community and the kids were facing having to see them and also at sometimes being abused again. Women had been in terrible cases of domestic violence. We didn't have enough shelters, so I was trying to do all of these things, and anyway, back then, but now it's a good thing because we've been able to do it. Do I think that sometimes the justice system sucks? Yes, it does, because it's very procedurally based, and if it's incorrect and a T is not crossed and an I is not dotted, you know, somebody fails at having access to justice. But I do feel that we've helped so many women. These women then create their own businesses in their communities. And I then work with different retailers, businesses to try and get them work. And I teach them how to do it. I sometimes also use my own brand in doing these collaborations, so people think I'm the king of collaborations in my country. But it's because I can collaborate. I allow people to use the name, my brand in the collaboration, but the work is being done by this woman. So also in my studio, I only have women working for me, which is quite a nurturing space. But more and more, and especially over the pandemic, the work wasn't just about women. It was just focused on gender-based violence. And it was a very big thing because there were lots of people, there were just no shelters for them. There were no shelters. They had nowhere to go. People, trans people, gay people were so abused during this time and so marginalized and so forgotten. So there was this other kind of virus, this other epidemic that was going on, and nobody was talking. So I actually worked the hardest ever in my entire life during this pandemic, because we're so busy, whether it was feeding programs, because these people didn't have access to funds to provide for themselves. But I mean, we rallied around, and I was very lucky that a lot of the people that support the work we do stepped up even further, and it was great, and having a connection even here in some way or the other lent kind of voice to what was happening on the ground. And I'm sure it was difficult all over the world in terms of marginalized communities, but I cannot tell you how bad it's been and how bad it continues to be in my country. And it's going to take some time, I hope, not a lot of time, but we need to acknowledge that there's a problem, because femicide is just on the increase. The level of gratuitous violence and the fact that people have somehow lost this concept or this ability to recognize the humanity in the next person. So the injuries you're seeing are actually quite brutal and quite hard as well, So the white light movement seeks to kind of address these things more and more in terms of trying to create financial inclusion for people who are victims of violence, empower them by teaching them a skill, whether it be a traditionally culturally based skill like sewing, embroidery, basket weaving, and then helping them or fostering an entrepreneurial spirit within them so that they don't become dependent on us, but they create their own businesses and we offer them all the support around it. And more now, I think it's going to become a tool or a vehicle to teach people about the harmful effects of violence, and looking at kind of people who are perpetrators of this violence as well. So speaking to young kind of men, and yeah, there are women who are also violent, but I mean predominantly men in these communities, and also creating access for migrants as well, because they're another group of people who are just voiceless and are in this lost kind of gray underworld.
Well, Gavin, this has been a very heavy and transformative conversation. We've spoken for a good hour, and I really am honored to have spent this time with you.
I know it's all my own thing.
I know it's a little bit, but your work is, I see you as a true creative. You take, I think, sometimes what we find of the human experience that is so deeply embedded in shadow, and you find a way to illuminate it and to bring it to a place that is light-filled and healing. And you have done this with your particular talents, your particular gifts, and your particular life experiences and the experiences of your ancestors. And so I thank you so much for sharing these gifts with the world that we live in.
Thank you.
I really
Thank you very
appreciate
much.
it.
So my studio is really focusing on women, development of young talent, and also the upskilling or the transfer of skills in terms of garment construction and making. So in my studio, I work with women from very vulnerable communities, victims of domestic violence or gender-based violence, and or parents, single parents who have gone through some very traumatic kind of abuse. Things that we do, for instance, are creating very finely, beautifully crafted garments with very fine techniques of embroidery, and literally we're using, these are just leftover pieces of silk, and we show them how to cut these things and to create amazing things. And you can see we do use traditional cultural skills, but we just change it up a bit, so it has a little bit more for a contemporary fashion feel. All the things that you see in the studio are all produced here. We take great pride in making things which are easily exportable, and we really look at how we can empower young designers as well. So part of what the studio does is work as an incubator for young talent of color, because we're still leveling the landscape in terms of access and exposure for young designers, especially designers of color. So my studio also trains young designers, young talent, and then I also work on a project called Future Wear, where I partner them with retailers to create beautiful collections which are accessible and they get paid for, and it's part of an 18-month long type of apprenticeship, I would say, but it's quite intense. And I think that's my role at the moment as a creative, is to drive this process of creativity, but make people very consciously aware of the transformation that's needed in the country and in our very vulnerable communities at the moment. This is my studio, and these are some of the very talented women that I work with that create these garments. The big project we're working on, which is a very big couture project, is literally very delicate embroideries. And what we did is we took, if you read the words carefully on this embroidery, it's actually beautiful embroidered testaments to people's lives and experiences. Testimonies of women who actually had been subjects of violence and sexual abuse. And we also alternated lines of poetry, French poetry by the poet Baudelaire, and it was from his collection of work called La Fleur de Mal, which is about love and the various kind of phases of being in love and what it means to be in love and what it meant to be love in a new kind of world. And we've also used a lot of chain detail, and the concept is also quite consultative in terms of women we talk to and people, because many women feel that their lives have been shackled, they're still in chains, they're still in level of bondage. So all of these are metal chains, which are embroidery. We were looking at also concept of the heart, using again continuing with the I motive in terms of being able to say in a statement, we see these people who perpetuate these kind of very tragic and horrible things against others. South Africa is more than anyone else is not immune to the concept of what it is to have discrimination in communities. But the concept also of what does it mean in terms of lives that matter, what does it mean in our current situation to be black or people of color, and how much harder we work to kind of be acknowledged, to fight for our rights, to gain justice for people. One of the projects I'm working with is with artist Zanele Maholi, who's commissioned me to create a range of interiors and soft furnishings, which is an extension of her work. Her work is really about occupying different spaces in different areas of society, and basically what we're looking at is what defines a new form of black luxury, and how, as a visual activist, your work can sit outside just being in galleries, but in people's personal spaces. So what I did was look at the work very carefully, and the idea was not to replicate the work. That wasn't my role at all, but was looking at the details within her body of work. And this body of work is Sonyama and Bonyama, which are a series of self-portraits, and taking ideas and elements from the back, from the picture itself, and then extending it. So each print is a limited edition print inspired by a particular work. This, for instance, this portrait here inspired a print which I created, which really looked at the use of cable ties, and in some way or the other I've taken all these details to create a print which sits with this. I've literally kind of taken the face out of it and then digitally manipulated it, and also in some way or the other, because the work is about identity and sexuality quite often, the prints have actually come out looking almost sometimes like Rorschach ink blots. But it's a very interesting piece of work that we're working on, because this body of work is going to be available globally, but part of the reason of why Maholi is looking at doing this is look at ways of how they can extend their support of young creatives, young photographers, artists, and visual activism as well. So included with this is a series of dresses I've made in sanitary pads as well, which speaks about feminine hygiene and the inaccessibility, and in some way or the other what it does to women in this country and in the continent and in other continents as well. We use our work in a visual activist type of way, but at the same time we are very keen on how we can foster change. And in a country like South Africa at the moment, in its history, change is really what we need. And the more creatives that can lend their voice to this, the better. But I think that's what your work is as you can become older, is about lending some kind of impetus or leaving a legacy, and that legacy is really about creating change and being socially impactful.